I'm really interested in the history of the presidents of the United States because these are the guys that have basically not only shaped the country, but to some extent have shaped the world. I say these are the guys because it's been all men. There's a woman running for president, Kamala Harris. In fact, I will have a upcoming prediction podcast about who I think will win. A few weeks ago, I had on David Rubenstein to discuss his book on presidential history. But today we have Bill O'Reilly with his new book, Confronting the Presidents, No Spin Assessments from Washington to Biden. I would say Bill O'Reilly is one of the world's experts on presidential history. I mean, he's interviewed a bunch of presidents. He's written, in addition to this book, Confronting the Presidents, he's written books like Killing Reagan, Killing Kennedy, The United States of Trump. He's written all these books on Killing Lincoln was his most popular book. He's written all these books about the presidents. This book, his latest book, Confronting the Presidents, really is an in-your-face, like what was good and what was bad about each of these presidents. I learned so much stuff, a lot of scandalous stuff actually about well-known private, like the private lives of these presidents that we revere. And it's just fascinating. Also fascinating to talk to Bill, not only about the book and who the most underrated presidents are and all that kind of stuff, but also what's going on with the current election and what does he think of the candidates and the economy and inflation. So here's Bill O'Reilly on confronting the presidents, but also what's going on right now.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
So in all this research, and you uncover all these things I didn't know about any of these presidents, but in all this research, who would you say your opinion changed the most about in terms of the quality of their presidency?
Well, a guy like James K. Polk, nobody knows who he is. You go out on the street, you go, hey, how about that James K. Polk? They go, oh, he's a rapper, right? Yeah, nobody knows anything about him. But he was in the top 10 of presidents because he was able to expand America from ocean to ocean. And he was president during the Mexican-American War. Again, I mean, people have no idea. But the guy had a really solid vision of what America should be in the future, much more developed than his contemporaries. So he's one.
Actually, can I ask you about him? Because
sure,
he was critically important. He made the largest. He brought in the most land of any other president. Like people usually think, oh, Thomas Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase, but according to your book, he basically got that whole, all the kind of states around Mexico plus the whole Northwest region. Like and the other thing about him, which I learned in your book, he promised to stay only one term, and he did. I don't know of any other president who was like that.
There were a few. Rutherford Hayes, another guy nobody knows anything about, but Polk got all this territory for the United States. And remember, Great Britain and France and Spain, they wanted the western part of what is now the United States. So this wasn't like a layup. And Polk got it essentially free because we kicked the butt of the Mexican government, which was corrupt and didn't know what they were doing. And when we defeated them and they had to sign the Treaty of Hidalgo, we got all that land. And if they didn't sign a treaty, the United States would have Mexico. Mexico would be part of our country now, so they had to sign it. So Polk, and the reason Polk was a one-termer was that he knew he was going to die. And he died just a few months after he left office. He got one tour of the USA, and then he was down because this guy had horrendous health problems. But there were a few presidents, the Rutherford Hayes I mentioned, who didn't revere the power, okay? It's not like today, these politicians, all of them across the board, they love the power, James. They're in it for power. Many of our presidents in the past weren't that way. And, when you're not in it for the power, it's much easier to walk away.
It seems like a bygone tradition to not be in it for the power. Like you look at like Calvin Coolidge or Polk or some of these earlier presidents, they seem to have a real agenda about what they wanted to accomplish. They accomplished it. They left. And Calvin Coolidge is another undervalued president, I think, in history. What do you think has changed? Why when someone's like a billion years old, why do they cling to power?
Because fun. F-U-N, fun. It's fun. Ride around in Air Force One, have every whim, everything taken care of. Everybody kissing your butt. It's fun. They like it. And what's the alternative? So that's why they cling to power. And it's not looking out for the folks, I'll tell you that. Most of these politicians today, not only in the presidency, but in the Congress and in state legislatures, they're looking out for themselves, not the folks.
Yeah. And so what, again, what other presidents do you think actually came into office and did good? Because it's hard to recount the accomplishments of any recent president, maybe because history is too close.
Well, let's start with JFK. So that's 1960. And JFK had a vision. He wasn't a particularly courageous man. His brother, Bobby Kennedy, was much more courageous, took on the mafia and was willing to do things that JFK was not. But JFK had a vision. He wanted to get out of Vietnam before it blew up in our face, which it did. And I think that he wanted the plight of African Americans to be better. So I would give him a plus category in that. LBJ was unbelievably corrupt, incredibly corrupt. And while he did have some sympathies for downtrodden people, what he did was just massively incompetent. So he's a ridiculous guy. Nixon obviously broke the law, but Nixon's vision, particularly overseas, was good. And he got a lot of things done, which is why he won his second term in a landslide. Because the American people knew that he was a pretty smart guy, but then, of course, he went off the rails. Then Ford, very well-intentioned, all right? Not a brilliant man, but I think Ford essentially wanted to do good things. Carter comes in after Ford, beats him in 1976, and Carter was very well-intentioned. He really wanted to help people, but he was so in over his head. He just couldn't do the job. I mean, you got a guy from Georgia at that point, not a sophisticated state, and you're popping him into the most powerful position in the world, and he was clueless. He was clueless economically, he was clueless foreign policy, nobody respected him overseas, disaster. Reagan came in, and Reagan was the opposite of Carter. Reagan had a very tunnel vision guy. This is the way countries should be run. And Reagan's presidency was successful, even though it was in and it was out, and he almost died because the assassin almost killed him, okay? Very successful. George Bush, the elder, he was a machine guy, all right? A Republican machine guy. I liked him. I thought he was, a decent man. I guess that's the word you want to use. But he wasn't a crusader or anything like that. Clinton came in. Clinton was a technician. And Clinton did some good for the country. And then he fouled it all up with the Lewinsky stuff. But Clinton was smart. Then after Clinton, you got into the modern era here. Bush the younger, 9/11 blows up his entire presidency and leads to catastrophe in Iraq. But Bush the younger, again, like his father, decent man. I mean, he wasn't conniving and he wasn't evil in any way at all. But he didn't manage the economy well, and he just got buried in the jihad and all that. That led to Barack Obama. Now, I reassess my opinion of Barack Obama because I know him pretty well. I interviewed him 3 times, and I work with him on Brothers Keeper, which is a project that is tremendous, which never really rose to where it should. Part of that was Obama's fault because he didn't embrace what I suggested he would do to make this mentoring, Brothers Keeper is mentoring inner city African-American youth. Tremendous program, still exists. But Obama, got hammered by conservatives, beat McCain, beat Romney, and Obamacare was really, but if you look at Obamacare now down the road, Obamacare has helped a lot of Americans. And there's no doubt about that. All right? It has. So that assessment changes. Obama made a huge mistake in Iraq, pulling all U.S. troops. ISIS then rose up. Obama recognized the mistake and then went back in and tried to, but Trump is the guy who really wiped out ISIS. And Obama's 8 years led to Trump because Americans are just kind of fed up with the whole establishment. They didn't like the end of the Obama era. And then Trump comes in. Trump himself is a deal maker. He wants what's best for America, but it's not a personal thing as far as the folks are concerned. He loves his supporters. He loves the MAGA people. But Trump is like, I'm going to make the best deals for the country. It kind of worked. And he was hit with COVID and all that. And then Biden came in, a disaster, an absolute disaster. Second worst president ever, because he created the problems. The bad presidents like Herbert Hoover, for example, he inherited the terrible economy, the Great Depression. Hoover was clueless, couldn't get us out of it. FDR had to. Hoover couldn't. His vision was so limited. Bad president. But Biden created the open border by himself. No Congress, nobody else. Him. And then ignited inflation from 1.4 when Trump left to more than 9%. How painful is that?
Take a quick break. If you like this episode, I'd really, really appreciate it. It means so much to me. Please share it with your friends and subscribe to the podcast. Email me at altucher@gmail.com and tell me why you subscribed. Thanks. There were multi-trillion-dollar bailouts in 2020. You can't say whether it was Congress, whether it was president. It was the increase in the money supply in 2020 that ultimately led to inflation, although it did occur under Biden's term, the actual inflation.
I will disagree with your assessment a bit. After COVID hit, the federal government had to go in and prop up both people and companies. They had to.
Yeah,
and they did it fairly successfully. But then the private economy kicked in pretty fast under Trump. And when Trump left, the employment was going up, the production was going up, and inflation was 1.4. All Biden had to do was ride that wave. But instead, he goes Inflation Reduction Act. Totally absurd. Not needed, and that blew up the printing of the dollar. But the worst thing Biden did, you can almost forgive him that mistake, was attacking the fossil fuel industry by slapping on all these regulations that made it much more difficult to harvest oil and other energy from the ground, fracking, okay? And then the en masse core companies that deal in fossil fuels raised all their prices. And then the truckers had to raise all their prices. And then the grocery store had to raise all their prices. That was the lighted fuse, that the combination of printing all these dollars. And the American people have known nothing about that. And Biden signed executive order after executive order after executive order under the banner of global warming that strangled the American energy industry. And of course, backtracked once the prices got out of control, essentials up 20%. Then now Biden's, pushing production all, but he's still not allowing Anwar drilling or the Keystone Pipeline, still, because he wants to placate the global warming progressive left. So Biden was a disaster top to bottom. I asked my Democrat friends, give me one thing that Joe Biden did that's helped this country. One. Crickets. You got one, James?
Let me think.
Okay, you got to think. It's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, and that's my point a little in general, is that the presidency doesn't really have, from a constitutional perspective, that many responsibilities, right? They can't make laws. They're just like a police force that enforces laws. They could veto laws, but that's rare. So, and they can propose laws, but again, some laws get passed, some don't. So it's hard to really that's why inflation and economy, I always think it's a mixed bag. It's hard to pinpoint, where these things actually start. But I see your point on the oil. Like normally, demand side inflation, if the price of apples go up, then people switch to peaches. But with oil, you have to use oil as part of almost every aspect of our lives so that you can't ignore the demand side inflation there. As opposed to money supply related inflation that happened.
And that's what happened. And you might be underestimating the power of the executive branch in 2024, because in the last 10 years, the executive orders coming out of the White House have been unbelievable.
I mean, speaking of which, like now we have this election. It's very polarizing, obviously, but in your book, there are times even more polarizing, particularly like right before the Civil War and in the presidencies before then. And then maybe in the events leading up to 1968 with Vietnam and everything going on then. Do you think this is what era of our past would you say this type of polarization is similar to?
Well, this is second. Civil War obviously is first. You got 1 million Americans dead from the war, from wounds and disease and all that. So that was the biggest catastrophe ever to hit this country. And now a second dwarfs what happened in Vietnam. We had polarization in Vietnam, obviously, but it wasn't fundamentals. It was policy. Okay, Vietnam policy engineered by Lyndon Johnson was a disaster, and some people wouldn't acknowledge that, but it was.
Right.
Now you have hatred, personal hatred, between the progressives and the traditionals. Not so much Democrat, Republican. It's the progressive movement that drives the Biden White House. And it's the traditional movement that doesn't want to pay for gender-altering surgery. They don't want to pay for that, okay? And there's no détente between the progressives and the traditionalists, none. They hate each other. And that's why you're seeing the political rhetoric coming out of Trump and Harris is so hot. I mean, they shook hands in front of the debate, but I don't know if that was a real sincere, hey, good luck. No.
But you know what's interesting about that is I sort of feel like everything is a strategy now. So even Kamala going up to Trump right at the beginning of the debate and shaking his hand, it's like she and her team had a meeting about it and decided to do that. And Trump probably had a similar meeting.
Right.
So how do you know now? Like, okay, so for instance, Kamala says, there's price gouging from grocers. But as you said, you have to look at if oil prices are raised, trucking prices are raised, healthcare prices are raised, how the grocers don't even control what they charge for products. So all of this economics coming out of the candidates like that it's just stupid. So how do you know what these people even believe in?
Well, you watch the No Spin News. My news broadcasts and radio broadcasts every day, because I'll tell you what their motivations are, what's true and what isn't true. And we don't do the ideological thing here. We don't do the party thing here. I'm registered independent. But I do see a tremendous amount of danger on the far left, because they want to change every part of our country, including the economy. They want to centralize federal government controlling the marketplace, and you can't do that. It's never worked in history. Yeah, but Americans are partially at fault, James, because of this. Because you make a nice living off this. So they spend the majority of their leisure time when they're not working staring at this.
At the phone,
rather than trying to read and trying to learn. That's why I wrote Confronting the Presidents. It's absolutely relevant today. What happened with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and on and on. It's relevant to today.
Well, and actually, it's so interesting. I didn't even know until I read your book how much their friendship had dissolved so that they were enemies. Like Thomas Jefferson planting stuff in the media about George Washington. It's crazy to think about.
Well, Jefferson didn't like the strong central government that Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams espoused. So, and Jefferson was kind of a sneaky guy. I mean, he's on the 10, but he was kind of a sneaky guy, Jefferson. And he, he's brilliant, and he helped every American in the freedom realm. There's no doubt Thomas Jefferson did that. But as a personal guy, very dubious.
Yeah, and so again, like, I don't understand how much of it is for show. Like when someone like the progressive left, or like Kamala appeasing the progressive left, says, "Oh, we've got to tax unrealized capital gains." Just economically, doesn't she realize that brings the economy to zero, basically?
She doesn't understand, doesn't want to understand. It's not really germane to her pursuit of power. This is what the progressive left wants. This is what Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren want. She's going to go along with it. It's what the money people in Hollywood, she's a front person. That's what she is. I mean, look, James, I don't want to sound really conceited here, but can you imagine me interviewing Kamala Harris one-on-one?
No.
Can you really picture that?
And I say that being a big admirer of how you interviewed Barack Obama, and you always, it was considerate from both sides. I remember the very first interview, I was expecting fireworks. This was before he was elected. I was expecting fireworks. There weren't any. You guys seemed like best friends by the end of it. And I learned a lot about both of you from watching that interview.
Yeah, and that's my job, that you learn about these people. So when Kamala Harris gives an interview to a Philadelphia reporter, and the reporter asks a very good question, how would you bring down inflation? You don't get more simple than that. It's a simple question. And then she launches for 2.5 minutes about her upbringing in Oakland, California. I mean, you don't get away with that with me. I would say, Madam Vice President, with all due respect, you're not even close to answering this question. I'll pose it again. How would you bring down inflation? That's how you do it. But unfortunately, the journalism industry has collapsed in America. And they've got people who won't do that because they don't want to get in trouble. They're happy with their paycheck coming in. They're told what to say, many of them, and they say it. They're getting well paid to be parrots. And yeah. I've been in the business 50 years. I know Mike Wallace, Tim Russert. I know Dan Rather, all these people. Okay,
here's
Peter
the problem
Jennings.
A little bit, though. Like here's the problem is that you get, if you take a side, if you're on a team, you get 80 million people like you. If you're not on a team, if you try to be unbiased, you already have a platform, Bill. But if you're starting out in news and you try to be unbiased, no one's going to like you. Both sides will hate you.
Well, you don't have to be unbiased. See, that's the key to success. All you have to be is fair and state your case to the audience, whoever your audience is. This is why I believe what I believe, and here's why I back it up. But I'm going to interview, Shirley over here, and she sees it differently. But I'm not going to hate Shirley. I'm not going to try to make Shirley look poor or bad, but I am going to press Shirley to answer my questions. The audience will respect that. I mean, look, my audience is not ideological. It's all over the place, and it's worldwide now thanks to YouTube. I don't even know what YouTube was. And my people coming in go, hey, you have 50 million views on YouTube. And I go, what? I mean, 10 times more people watch me on the social media now than watch me at Fox. 10 times more. It's crazy. It's a new world. But I haven't changed. I'm the same. I'm in your face. If I ask a question, I want an answer. But what's changed is the other people in my business, most of them don't do that. They let these politicians go off on tangents, and Trump gets that treatment too. I mean, Trump goes, my question to Trump, and I asked this to J.D. Vance a couple of weeks ago when he was on the No Spin News, how are you going to deport 10 million migrants? How are you going to do it? Courts are going to block you. You must know that. How's that going to happen? And Vance really didn't have any answer for it because it isn't going to happen. And that's my job, to make Americans understand what's real and what's BS.
So if this election comes in close, which it looks like obviously it will, it seems like it's down to a few swing states, and all of the swing states are like almost dead even right now in the polls. What do you think happens November 6th, the day after the election?
No idea, because I'm not Miss Cleo, I'm not clairvoyant, and so many things in the next 7 weeks are going to occur that nobody knows about. I mean, it's just, this election is so chaotic, is so much pandemonium on both sides, that anybody saying, oh, this is what I think is going to happen, it's ridiculous, because there are so many factors that are going to influence Americans. Look, both candidates have their base. The MAGA people are going to vote for Trump. They don't care what happens. And the progressives and liberal people are going to vote for Harris, and they couldn't care less if she's a communist or a socialist. Both believe what they want to believe. But that middle group is bigger than people think. And they can be swayed if something appears to them that makes sense. So yesterday I said that if I'm candidate Trump and I want to win, and I'm assuming he does want to win, but he's making mistakes that are almost inexplicable, you know?
Like what? The debate was a mistake, and some things he did in the debate was a mistake, but what else did he do?
Well, I don't think eating Cocker Spaniels helped him, did you?
No, that's what I mean. The debate, he kind of fell apart.
Well, I don't think he fell apart. He just allowed the moderators to put him on the defensive, and he didn't narrate the debate. All you got to do is narrate the debate, tell the people in real time what's happening. That's all, and you win. I mean,
like you mean saying, like, look, I'm not being fact checked here. I mean, Kamala's not being fact checked.
You could say to David Muir, the ABC guy, hey, that was a pretty big softball you just gave him to the vice president, and you let her wail on me. All right, do you have a softball for me, David? Can you give me one? Not say you do it. You just be upfront. You don't go on the defensive. But the unforced errors that Trump is making are hurting him. There's no doubt. So what I said yesterday was, look, if I'm Trump after this Florida thing, I write a letter to the American people. And I put it out on my social media account calling for a tamping down of hatred. And then I say, I hope my opponent signs this letter. So you are proactive now, trying to tamp down the political hatred in this country. And you are the target of it. That puts him into a very, very good place. But, you know, I know the man 35 years. I've written a book, The United States Trump, that explains why he does what he does. But right now, he's just careening. If he focuses, he could very well win.
Yeah, it's interesting. I thought after RFK Jr., that was an extra, let's say, 2% at least across every state that was going to go towards him. But it didn't, now the polls are back to where they were before.
RFK Jr. is not a factor in this race.
At the time, he was polling about 5% evenly across all the states, but that seems to have diminished. I mean, in terms of how aware people are of him. In your book, look at 1876, that election. That was a bitter election. Rutherford B. Hayes, your guy. Was one where I was thrown into the House of Representatives and corrupt deals were made, just like, John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. So there have been times where the nation's been divided, but there's a lot of vitriol there were protests in D.C. in 1876 on Inauguration Day, or in 1877. So, the vitriol has existed, but now it does seem like it's pulling families apart, in ways that I've never seen before.
That's because of social media.
Yeah.
The media is so intense in this country now. The combination of corporate media, which is essentially corrupt, and social media, which has no editors, it's the Wild West. Combination, and you can ramp people up to an extent that you couldn't do it in 1876, when most people are just trying to figure out how they're going to eat supper. What kind of bear can I shoot to have a dinner? It's a little bit different. But now with this electronic and devices everywhere, it's easy to incite, and that's the big difference.
Do you think back in the days of, let's say, Walter Cronkite, the reporters were truly neutral or fair?
They weren't. They've never been that way, but they were much better trained, and there was a standard of behavior, because I was there, that you had to adhere to. And if you didn't, you were fired or you didn't get anywhere in your career. So there were standards. I mean, when I took jobs, I was handed the Associated Press standard book, and this is how you do it. But no, I mean, people are people. They've always had biases, always had belief systems. Peter Jennings was a liberal man, and I know him as well as anybody professionally because I work very closely with him. But he never let that bleed over to his presentation. I mean, if he was going to ask somebody a tough question and there were two people, he'd ask the other person a tough question. But that doesn't happen anymore. I got about 3 minutes, and the reason I'm liking this conversation, James, you're doing a very good job, but I got people lined up for media on confronting the presidents, but we got about three minutes.
So of the presidents you researched in the book, did any stand out, not as good or bad, but a fascinating personality that you could see writing a novel about? Because, you've written many novels about the presidents as well.
No, they aren't novels. They're all nonfiction. It's the Killing series.
Right, but they're, it's almost like I've read them. It's almost like a fictionalized version of what happened.
Yeah, but it's all true. So I don't want to confuse anybody. Everything that I write is all true, 100% backed up. We write in a style that it's entertaining. See, most nonfiction is dull. Abraham Lincoln, far and away the best personality. I wrote Killing Lincoln, my first book. I mean, here's a guy who loses his young son. His wife is a nut. He almost loses the war. He deteriorates physically in 4 years. If you look at pictures when Lincoln took over, and then 4 years later, it's like two different human beings. I mean, this guy overcame so many things. And in the process, he was kind. He was a kind individual. So he one of a kind. George Washington, fascinating guy. Tremendous presence. Won the Revolutionary War. I don't think there's a handful of people maybe could have done that. We were just fortunate to have him in charge of our forces here. All of the presidents, all 45 of them, had aspects of their personality that were fascinating to me. Teddy Roosevelt, my God. I mean, this guy was just, the cliche is a force of nature, but he was. And he accomplished so much, and he had a very clear vision of what he wanted to do. But they were all flawed men. And that's the real crux of confronting the presidents. I tell you, the good, the bad, we kind of leave out some of the ugly, but not all of it. Particularly in Lyndon Johnson, who, boy, talk about a bad guy. You want a bad guy? That's the guy.
And it is fascinating to read about all these little-known names, like let's say the Millard Fillmores of the presidency, where, it's just, they're never written about, never talked about, but it's interesting to see how their place in history and so on. And you cover all of this in the book. Really great book. I love the topic. I love the book. Good job. Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, Bill, and would enjoy the opportunity to talk to you again on your next book or whenever.
Well, we'll definitely do that, James. Nice job, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.